Willow Creek Park buzzed with joyful activity on a sunny Sunday, but Margaret Turner's day was far from serene amidst the lively scene. Margaret paced anxiously near a shaded bench, her usually composed demeanor unraveling. Her brows furrowed as her eyes darted across the bustling park. She had been searching for over an hour for her missing wallet, a sleek black clutch containing her ID, credit cards, and a significant sum of cash. Each minute that passed without finding it only heightened her frustration. She retraced her steps for the third time, scanning the ground near the bench where she had sat earlier, but the wallet was nowhere to be seen. Where could it have gone? She muttered under her breath, her tone laced with rising panic. She glanced around, her gaze sharpening as it fell on Clara James, a black woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a park cleaner's uniform. Clara moved methodically along the pathway, her cart of supplies rattling softly with each step as she picked up stray litter. Her movements were unhurried yet purposeful, a quiet diligence in her every action. Margaret's unease twisted into suspicion. From her vantage point, she had noticed Clara bend down near a picnic table a short while ago and pick something up. It was a harmless enough action, yet Margaret couldn't shake the thought that it might have been her wallet. The thought gnawed at her until it consumed her reasoning. Why hadn't Clara reported finding anything? And why was she still near the bench? Clara, unaware of Margaret's scrutiny, was focused on her work. She had indeed found a wallet earlier and, not wanting to abandon her duties, placed it securely in her cart, planning to turn it over to the park's office once she finished her shift. The small act, for her, was second nature, a matter of responsibility and decency. But Margaret's mind was already spinning with assumptions. Her anxiety festered into a conviction that Clara must have taken it. With narrowed eyes and a tightening grip on her purse strap, Margaret made up her mind to confront the cleaner, setting into motion a scene that would soon draw the attention of the entire park. Clara James moved along the park's winding paths, her cleaning cart rattling softly as she worked. She enjoyed her job, even on days like this when the park was busy and litter seemed to multiply with every passing hour. To her, keeping the park clean was more than a job. It was her way of contributing to the community. Today, she had found a wallet lying on the ground near a picnic table. Without hesitation, she had picked it up and placed it in her cart, intending to hand it over to the authorities at the park office as soon as she finished her round. However, Clara's quiet sense of duty was about to be disrupted. Margaret Turner, standing a few feet away, had been watching Clara with increasing suspicion. Her earlier frustration over losing her wallet had festered into a narrative of blame. To Margaret, the sight of the cleaner bending down near the picnic table was enough to confirm her fears. Clara, she decided, must have found her wallet, and she must be planning to keep it. Margaret squared her shoulders, her frustration bubbling over into determination. She strode toward Clara, her steps brisk and deliberate, her face set with righteous indignation. "Excuse me," Margaret called out, her voice sharp and cutting through the ambient noise of the park. Clara, startled, turned toward the approaching woman, wiping her hands on the towel tucked into her apron. "Yes, ma'am," she asked politely, her tone calm and open. Margaret's eyes flicked to the cleaning cart. "I've been looking for my wallet for over an hour," she said, her voice tight with accusation. "I think you've taken it." Clara's brow furrowed in confusion. "Your wallet? I haven't taken anything, ma'am. I'm just doing my job." "I saw you pick something up over there," Margaret said, pointing toward the picnic table. Her tone was growing louder, more forceful. "Don't lie to me. You put it in your cart, didn't you?" Clara's confusion turned to unease as she realized where this was heading. She took a calming breath and responded evenly. "I did find a wallet near that table. I put it in my cart to keep it safe, and I plan to report it to the park office as soon as I finished my cleaning." Margaret crossed her arms tightly, her posture stiff with mistrust. "Why would you wait to report it? That's my wallet, and I want it back now." Clara maintained her composure despite the accusatory tone. "If it's yours, ma'am, you can describe it to me. I'll return it to you." But Margaret was beyond reasoning. Her voice grew louder, catching the attention of parkgoers nearby. "Don't play games with me. I know it's my wallet. You're just trying to keep it." Clara glanced around, noticing that people were starting to watch. Some had paused their activities to observe, while others whispered amongst themselves. A few even pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. Clara's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration, but she refused to let her emotions show. "Ma'am, I assure you, I'm not trying to keep anything," Clara said, her voice still calm but firm. "If this is your wallet, I'm happy to give it to you, but I need you to describe it first." Margaret scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "This is ridiculous. You're just making excuses. I'll call the police and let them sort this out." Before Clara could respond, Margaret pulled out her phone, dialing 911 with exaggerated motions, as if ensuring everyone could see what she was doing. Her voice took on an air of urgency as she spoke to the dispatcher. "Yes, I'm at Willow Creek Park, and there's a woman here who has stolen my wallet. She's refusing to give it back. Please send someone immediately." Clara sighed softly, her shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of the moment. She had no reason to fear the police. She knew she had done nothing wrong. But the prospect of being accused publicly, especially in a racially charged scenario, left a bitter taste in her mouth. She glanced at the crowd forming around them, a mix of curiosity, sympathy, and skepticism on their faces. Margaret slipped her phone into her pocket with a triumphant expression, her arms crossed as she stared Clara down. "We'll see what you have to say when the police get here," she said, her tone brimming with self-righteous confidence. Clara stood silently, her hands clasped in front of her, refusing to engage further. She knew that anything she said now would likely be twisted or ignored. Instead, she waited, determined to let the truth speak for itself when the time came. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Some parkgoers shook their heads in disapproval, while others whispered among themselves, speculating about what had happened. A few voices were supportive of Clara, calling out phrases like, "Give her a chance," and "This is unnecessary." But others seemed to side with Margaret, nodding in agreement or murmuring about how suspicious Clara looked. Clara ignored the noise, focusing on staying calm and composed. Her years of working in the park had taught her the value of patience, even in the face of unwarranted hostility. But as the distant sound of sirens reached her ears, she couldn't help but feel a pang of apprehension. She straightened her posture, bracing herself for what was to come. Margaret, on the other hand, felt a surge of satisfaction as the sirens grew louder. She was convinced that the arrival of the police would validate her actions, proving her right and forcing Clara to return her wallet. She glanced around the crowd, her expression one of smug triumph, as if daring anyone to challenge her version of events. The stage was set. The police were on their way, and the confrontation was about to escalate in ways neither woman could predict. The distant sound of sirens grew louder, slicing through the once cheerful ambience of Willow Creek Park. The murmurs among the growing crowd swelled with anticipation, their eyes darting between Margaret, whose face was flushed with indignation, and Clara, who stood calm but visibly weary. Within moments, a patrol car pulled up near the park entrance. Two officers stepped out, their authoritative presence commanding immediate attention. The first was a tall, stern-looking male officer, and the second, a shorter but equally composed female officer, scanned the scene with a sharp, assessing gaze. They moved toward the crowd with purposeful strides, the atmosphere thick with tension. Margaret wasted no time, practically rushing toward them. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That woman over there," she said, pointing at Clara, "stole my wallet. I saw her take it, and she's refusing to give it back." The officers exchanged a glance, but maintained their neutral expressions. The female officer raised a hand to calm Margaret. "Ma'am, please take a step back and let us handle this." They approached Clara, who stood by her cart, her hands clasped in front of her. She gave the officers a polite nod as they stopped a few feet away. The male officer addressed her first, his tone firm but professional. "Ma'am, we received a call about a stolen wallet. Can you explain what's going on here?" Clara met his gaze, her voice steady but laced with weariness. "Yes, officers. I found a wallet near a picnic table earlier while I was cleaning. I placed it in my cart to keep it safe and planned to turn it in at the park office when I finished my shift. I didn't take anything. The female officer nodded, her expression thoughtful. Do you still have the wallet with you? Clara gestured toward her cart. Yes, ma'am. It's right here. Slowly, she retrieved the wallet and handed it to the female officer. The officer opened it, confirming its contents before turning to Margaret. Ma'am, can you describe your wallet and what's inside it? Margaret puffed up with confidence. It's black, leather, and has my ID, credit cards, and about $200 in cash. The female officer glanced down at the wallet, checking the details. Satisfied, she handed it to Margaret. This matches your description. Margaret snatched the wallet with a look of vindication, clutching it tightly. See? I told you she had it. She was probably planning to keep it. The male officer's brow furrowed slightly. Ma'am, he said, his voice calm but firm. Finding a lost wallet and holding onto it to turn it in isn't a crime. Based on what we've seen and heard, this woman acted responsibly. Margaret's face reddened, and her voice rose again. But why didn't she report it immediately? It's suspicious. She must have thought no one was watching. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tide of opinion beginning to shift. Some shook their heads at Margaret's behavior, while others whispered about how calm and respectful Clara had been throughout the ordeal. The female officer stepped forward, her tone measured but firm. Ma'am, holding on to an item to return it or report it later doesn't imply theft. Unless there's evidence that she intended to keep your wallet, there's no crime here. Margaret's confidence faltered as the officer's words sank in. But I know what I saw, she stammered, glancing nervously at the crowd, which now seemed more skeptical of her actions than Clara's. The male officer looked around at the onlookers, many of whom were filming the scene on their phones. He turned back to Margaret, his voice taking on a sterner edge. Calling the police is a serious matter, ma'am. Accusing someone without evidence not only wastes resources, but can also harm an innocent person. Margaret's shoulders slumped, her indignation crumbling under the weight of the officer's reasoning and the judgmental stares of the crowd. She glanced at Clara, who remained composed, her hands resting on her cart. For a brief moment, guilt flickered across Margaret's face. Clara broke the silence. I understand why she might have been upset, she said, her voice calm but firm. Losing something important can be stressful. But I hope this reminds all of us to think before assuming the worst. The crowd murmured their agreement, and the officers nodded, clearly impressed by Clara's grace under pressure. The female officer turned to Clara. Thank you for cooperating and for your patience in handling this situation. Clara gave a small nod. I was just doing my job. The officers stepped back, signaling that their intervention was over. The male officer looked at Margaret one last time. Ma'am, we encourage you to be more cautious before making accusations in the future. Margaret muttered a faint, I'm sorry, but her words were drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd. The weight of her actions, and the public spectacle she had created, pressed down on her as the officers returned to their car. The crowd began to disperse, though the buzz of discussion lingered in the air. Clara turned back to her cart, quietly resuming her work. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, her wallet clutched tightly in her hands, her face pale with embarrassment as she realized the depth of her mistake. The park began to return to its normal rhythm as the officers walked away, but the murmurs and whispers among the onlookers continued. Margaret stood rooted in place, clutching her wallet tightly, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had expected validation, vindication, and perhaps even applause for her actions. Instead, she was met with skeptical glances, disapproving murmurs, and the quiet dignity of the woman she had accused. Clara James resumed her work, moving her cart a few feet away, as if to create some distance from the lingering tension. But she was still within earshot, and the words floating through the crowd reached her as clearly as they reached Margaret. Why'd she jump to conclusions like that? One man said, shaking his head. Poor woman, another muttered, referring to Clara. She didn't deserve that. Typical, a younger woman scoffed, holding up her phone. It's all going online anyway. Margaret's face burned hotter with each passing comment. She avoided eye contact with those around her, but the weight of their judgment pressed down on her. She glanced at Clara, expecting to see anger or gloating, But instead, she found a woman who was calm, composed, and back at work as if nothing had happened. But the tension hadn't entirely dissipated. The female officer, who had been speaking quietly into her radio a few feet away, suddenly turned back toward the scene. She approached Clara again, her expression shifting from neutral professionalism to something more formal, almost respectful. "Ms. James," the officer said, her voice audible enough for Margaret and a few nearby onlookers to hear. "Thank you again for your patience. Is there anything else you'd like us to address before we leave?" Margaret's brow furrowed. "Ms. James?" The formality caught her off guard. Why was the officer addressing Clara so respectfully? And why did she suddenly feel like she had missed something important? Clara shook her head with a polite smile. "No, officer, I think that's everything. Thank you for handling this fairly." The female officer nodded and exchanged a brief look with her partner. He raised an eyebrow, but she gave a subtle nod, signaling agreement on some unspoken matter. Then the officer turned back to Clara, adding softly, "We appreciate everything you do for the park and the community." The words hit Margaret like a hammer. The park and the community? What did that mean? Margaret's eyes widened as she replayed the events of the last hour in her head, piecing together the small details she had ignored in her blind anger. Clara's calm demeanor, the officer's respectful tone, the fact that they seemed to recognize her by name. It all pointed to something Margaret hadn't considered. The male officer addressed the gathering crowd, his voice cutting through the murmur of voices. "For those of you watching, let this be a reminder to think before making accusations. Everyone deserves respect, regardless of their appearance or position." Margaret flinched at the words, her face growing hotter. It was clear that the officer's message was meant for her. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, but the lump in her throat made it impossible to form words. Then Clara turned to her, her expression as calm as it had been all along. There was no anger in her eyes, no gloating or bitterness, only a quiet dignity that made Margaret feel even smaller. "I hope this has been a lesson for all of us," Clara said, addressing Margaret and the crowd at large. "Jumping to conclusions doesn't help anyone. We're all part of this community, and we should treat each other as such." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The crowd, which had grown quieter during her brief speech, murmured in agreement. Some even clapped softly, acknowledging Clara's grace and composure. Margaret swallowed hard, unable to meet Clara's gaze. The reality of what she had done, and the public nature of her humiliation, was sinking in. She mumbled a barely audible "I'm sorry" before turning away, but her voice was lost in the shuffle as people began dispersing, their interest in the spectacle waning. As Clara moved on with her work, Margaret stood alone, her shoulders slumped and her pride shattered. She clutched her wallet tighter, realizing that in her rush to accuse, she had not only hurt someone innocent, but also exposed her own biases for the entire park to see. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but she couldn't deny the truth of Clara's words. Everyone deserved respect, and she had failed to show it. The lesson, though painfully learned, was now hers to carry. The park began to settle after the incident, but Margaret's mind remained in turmoil. She stood near the bench where it had all started, clutching her wallet and staring at the ground. The realization of her actions had begun to sink in, but there was something else nagging at her. The way the officers had addressed Clara with a tone of respect that Margaret couldn't ignore. The female officer, who had lingered for a moment to speak into her radio, turned toward Clara once more. Her expression shifted into something more formal, her shoulders straightening as she approached the cleaner. "Ms. James," the officer began, her voice loud enough for Margaret and a few nearby onlookers to hear. "Thank you for your cooperation today and for your continued service to this community. Your work here at the park and your volunteer efforts do not go unnoticed." Margaret's head snapped up at the words. Volunteer efforts? Service to the community? What was the officer talking about? Margaret's curiosity turned to confusion, then disbelief, as the officer continued. "We appreciate all you've done to improve this park and your contributions to the local youth outreach program," the officer added. "Your commitment is an inspiration." The crowd, which had not fully dispersed, began murmuring again. People exchanged surprised glances, and a few clapped in acknowledgement of Clara's contributions. Clara, humble as always, gave the officer a small smile and a polite nod. "Thank you, officer. I'm just doing what I can." Margaret's face went pale as the truth hit her. Clara wasn't just a cleaner. She was an active member of the community, someone who went above and beyond to make the park and the lives of others better. The officers clearly knew her, not just as a worker, but as someone they respected deeply. And Margaret had spent the last hour accusing her of theft in front of all these people. Clara turned briefly toward Margaret, her expression still calm, but tinged with something else: disappointment. "I hope this will remind all of us not to judge too quickly," Clara said softly, her words directed at Margaret but resonating with the entire crowd. Margaret swallowed hard, her shame now complete. She had made an innocent woman's life harder and revealed her own biases for all to see. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Instead, she stood frozen as Clara gracefully returned to her work, leaving Margaret to grapple with the weight of her actions. As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret remained frozen near the bench, clutching her wallet as though it could shield her from the overwhelming shame that consumed her. The murmurs around her had turned into quiet whispers, and she could feel the weight of judgment in every glance cast her way. A group of teenagers walked by, shaking their heads as one muttered, "She really thought she was doing something." Margaret wanted to disappear. The sting of her humiliation burned hotter with every passing second, and her earlier conviction now seemed absurd, even to herself. She had assumed the worst about Clara based solely on appearance and circumstance, exposing not just her own biases but also a lack of common sense. Clara's calm dignity throughout the ordeal stood in stark contrast to Margaret's own behavior. Margaret looked toward Clara, who was once again pushing her cleaning cart, calmly resuming her work as if nothing had happened. But Margaret knew better. She had interrupted this woman's day, tarnished her reputation in front of a crowd, and wasted police resources, all because of her own unfounded assumptions. As she turned to leave the park, Margaret couldn't ignore the whispers of people who still lingered. "That poor woman," one said. "At least Clara showed her what grace looks like." Margaret walked briskly toward her car, her heart pounding. The weight of the incident pressed heavily on her, and the voice in her head whispered a painful truth: "This is your fault." That night, as she sat at her kitchen table, Margaret replayed the events in her mind. For the first time, she saw her actions for what they were, not a defense of justice but an exercise in prejudice. And she realized she owed Clara far more than an apology. She owed her a change. The morning after the incident, Margaret woke up with a heavy heart. Sleep had evaded her the night before as the events of the previous day replayed over and over in her mind. The image of Clara standing silently, calm and composed despite the accusations, contrasted sharply with Margaret's own frantic, accusatory behavior. The officer's words, the murmurs of the crowd, and Clara's quiet dignity all echoed in her thoughts. She knew she had wronged an innocent woman and, in doing so, revealed parts of herself she was ashamed to confront. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. She opened the browser, searching for contact information for the Willow Creek Park office. When she found the number, she hesitated, her finger hovering over the call button. What do I even say? Will she even want to hear it? Summoning her courage, Margaret pressed the button and listened to the line ring. A receptionist answered, and Margaret nervously explained who she was and why she was calling. "I'd like to arrange a meeting with Miss Clara James," she said, her voice trembling. "I owe her an apology." The receptionist hesitated, but eventually agreed to pass along the message. Margaret hung up, her heart pounding. She didn't know if Clara would respond, but she felt relief at having taken the first step. 2 days later, Margaret received a call back. The receptionist informed her that Clara had agreed to meet her at the park office. Margaret's chest tightened with both dread and gratitude. She didn't have to agree to this, Margaret thought. She's giving me a chance. That afternoon, Margaret walked into the park office, her stomach churning with anxiety. Clara was already there, sitting calmly at a small table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She greeted Margaret with a polite nod but didn't speak, waiting for Margaret to begin. Margaret sat down across from Clara, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said softly, her voice shaky. "I know I'm the last person you probably want to see." Clara didn't interrupt, her expression neutral but attentive. Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Clara's. "I'm so sorry for what I did," she began. "I judged you without knowing you, and I accused you of something terrible. I let my frustration and my biases take over. I was wrong, and there's no excuse for it." Clara listened quietly, her expression softening slightly as Margaret continued. "You didn't deserve any of that. And seeing how you handled yourself, with such grace, it just made me realize how much I have to work on myself. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say this." When Margaret finished, Clara nodded slowly, taking a moment to respond. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," Clara said gently. "We all have moments when we let our emotions get the better of us. What matters is what we do after those moments." Margaret blinked back tears, surprised by Clara's understanding. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I'll do better. I'll learn from this." Clara gave a faint smile. "I hope you do. We're all part of this community, and we should treat each other with kindness, no matter what." The two women shook hands before parting ways. Margaret left the meeting with a sense of relief, but also with a renewed commitment to change. She knew her apology was just the beginning. If she truly wanted to make amends, she needed to confront her biases and work toward becoming a better person. That day marked the start of Margaret's journey, not just to redeem herself in Clara's eyes, but to reshape her own perspective on respect, community, and compassion. In the days following her heartfelt apology to Clara, Margaret began to take tangible steps to address the biases that had led to her actions. She attended community workshops on racial equity and implicit bias, determined to better understand the harm caused by prejudice. She also volunteered at local outreach programs, working alongside people from diverse backgrounds and learning from their experiences. Slowly, she began to rebuild her perspective and regain a sense of purpose rooted in empathy and understanding. Clara, meanwhile, continued her work at Willow Creek Park and her volunteer efforts in the community. She remained a quiet force for good, using her actions rather than words to inspire change. The incident at the park became a teachable moment for the community, sparking conversations about assumptions, respect, and the importance of withholding judgment. Margaret often returned to the park, not to dwell on her past mistakes, but to remind herself of the lessons she had learned. She would see Clara from time to time, and always offered her a smile of gratitude. For Margaret, the encounter had been transformative. It had opened her eyes to the harm of assumptions and taught her that true change begins with acknowledging one's flaws and working to grow beyond them.